hope there's a fantastic message for our students in the audience there, that there's a real role for you to play in public service, and especially in these emerging issues. Next, we're going to have a presentation from David Leonhardt on his new book, Ours Was the Shining Future. It's the story of the American dream. And I'm going to ask Damien Duin to come introduce David. Damien is the founder and chief executive of Lafayette Square. Previously, he served as co-founder and co-CEO of Brightwood Capital Advisors. Damien began his career at Goldman Sachs in New York and in London. And before that, Damien was also at Credit Suisse. You know, what I'm really impressed by, I should tell you, first of all, that Damien is a former student. So it's such an honor to present my former student here. But I'm really proud of the work that Damien has been doing. He's a capitalist, but he's really become a thought leader on issues related to mass incarceration. And he's trying to use capitalism for good, right? And he's really become a role model on these issues. He's written for the Financial Times, for Entrepreneur, for Inc.com, and he serves on the board of several nonprofits and has made this his mission. He is a proud Hoya and got his undergraduate degree here at the business school at Georgetown University. So welcome, Damien. Damien is going to introduce David.
Thank you for that, Professor Agarwal. We're so pleased to have David Leonhardt at this year's FMQ conference. David Leonhardt is one of our country's preeminent journalists and writers on the economy and has worked at the New York Times for nearly 25 years. He currently authors The Morning, the Times' flagship daily newsletter, and writes for the Sunday Review. Prior to joining the Times in 1999, David worked for Businessweek magazine and the Washington Post. David has previously been an op-ed columnist, Washington bureau chief, co-host of the Argument podcast, founding editor of the Upshot section, and a staff writer for the Times magazine. He also led a strategy group that helped Times leadership shape the newsroom's digital future. In 2009, David won the Gerald Loeb Award for magazine writing. In 2009, for his New York Times magazine article, Obamanomics. In 2011, he received the Pulitzer for commentary. He recently published a new book entitled Ours Was the Shining Future, the Story of the American Dream, where he examines the history of the American economic engine from the Great Depression to today's Great Stagnation. The book traces how democratic capitalism once flourished to make the American dream possible. But by the end of the 20th century, the dream evolved from one that promised prosperity for most into one that favors the individual and the privileged few. Please join us during the networking reception up in the Fisher Colloquium, where David will be signing copies of his book. But first, please join me in welcoming David Leonhardt to the stage to discuss his new book, Ours Was the Shining Future, the Story of the American Dream. David.
Thank you, Damien, for that generous introduction. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I set out to write a biography of the American dream. And my basic idea about that was that, like some historical characters with famous names, almost everyone has heard of the American dream. But I think the backstory behind it is something that often is not well understood. The phrase the American dream dates to 1931. Before that, if you look through old newspapers, and I spent a lot of time looking through old newspapers when writing this book, you would occasionally find the word American next to the word dream, but it was sort of accidental. It's not the way we mean American dream now. The phrase that we use now dates to 1931, which is remarkable because the phrase American dream was coined really very close to the depths of the Great Depression by a historian named James Truslow Adams, who defined it as that American dream of a better, richer, happier life for all our citizens of every rank. And he said it was the United States' greatest contribution to the world. that idea. And even almost 100 years later, I love that definition because it contains so much about the ways that we still think about the American dream. Better, richer, happier life. Embedded in that is the notion of progress. Your life gets better over time. Your life is better than your parents' lives were. Your children's lives will be better than yours. It also embeds the notion of social mobility. He said it should apply to all of our citizens for every rank. And he noted that it was distinctly American, that in much of the world it was natural to stay roughly in the circumstances of your birth, but not in this country. And what I wanted to try to do was ask the question of how well are we measuring up to his definition of the American dream? My book is a book of stories. It's a book of people whose names are well known, but I think their full significance is not, like A. Philip Randolph and Robert F. Kennedy and Robert Bork. It's also a book about people who are much less familiar, like Anne Gorsuch and Grace Hopper and Carl Skoglund. I'm not going to tell you those stories in the few minutes I'm up here, but I just want to give you a brief sense of the frame for my argument, which is really an attempt to help people understand the biggest forces that have been affecting the American economy. And I would argue we have not been living up to the basic definition of the American dream, of a better, richer, happier life for all. You sometimes will hear pundits, people with jobs like mine, or politicians, including President Biden, say, why aren't people happier with the condition of the American economy? Our unemployment rate is low, our GDP growth is pretty good. By some measures, our GDP growth has moved the United States past the countries of Europe. We've opened up a bigger gap in recent years. But I think when you actually look at the ways that people measure their lives, if you look at the things that affect people's day-to-day living standards, life in this country really has stagnated over the last few decades. You can see it in the income and wealth measures. Income growth for the bottom 90% of earners has trailed economic growth in recent decades. Wealth growth has been very slow. Various measures of social well-being, like the percentage of children who grow up with two parents, or the percentage of Americans who suffer chronic pain, or the percentage of Americans who've lived behind bars at some point in their lives, those have all worsened. If you look at polls and ask Americans, how do you feel about our country and our economy? It's not just now that people are grouchy. It's been almost 20 years since most Americans thought that our country was on the right track. And I know there have certainly been improvements. There are less of many forms of discrimination. We have these amazing computers in our pockets that let us listen to any song or read any book pretty much all the time. But to me, if there were any doubt about the idea that life expectancy, that living standards have stagnated in this country, it is life expectancy, which is in many ways the most basic measure of how well a society is treating its citizens. In 1980, which is really the beginning of the modern economic era in so many ways, the United States had a typical life expectancy for a rich country, similar to much of Western Europe, Canada, Australia. Today, and for most of the last 2 decades, we've had the lowest life expectancy of any rich country in the world, lower than all those countries I just mentioned, every country in Western Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea. It's the first chart in my book. It's really not that close. We trail those other countries by a significant amount in life expectancy. And it was not ever thus. There's not something inherently American about having low life expectancy. Within the lifespans of most of us, the United States had a relatively normal life expectancy. So why is that? That is in many ways the central question that I tried to answer. And since this is a bipartisan conference, I will say some critical things about both parties. I think that the Republican Party, not all of it, but much of it has remained wedded to that same economic model we've had since the 1980s, which I think when Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan offered it was a reasonable diagnosis for a way to restart the economy after the problems of the 70s. Get rid of labor unions, reduce regulations, reduce taxes, specifically on rich people, let companies grow very large and let them become very efficient. That's what they said they were going to do. That's what they did. They promised that would lead to greater prosperity for all Americans. I think through the numbers that I've just gone through, you know that I'm going to argue it has not led to greater prosperity for all Americans. It's helped lead to this era of stagnation that we've had. Now, I said not all Republicans. I think it's important to point out that there are significant parts of the Republican Party that have begun to question this laissez-faire or neoliberal model. You can see it in Marco Rubio saying that labor unions are important. You can see it in Josh Hawley questioning whether companies have gotten too big. And although Donald Trump's economic policy is not particularly consistent or coherent, you can obviously see it in Donald Trump's questioning of things like trade. and his really rejection of much of what we thought was the Republican Party. But for the most part, large parts of the Republican Party, including the current majority on the Supreme Court, including much of Congress, including many of the ways that Trump governed, still do take as faith this idea that this laissez-faire economy is good for most Americans. And I just don't think the record supports that idea. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, has managed to alienate so many working class Americans, who I would define roughly as the Americans without a four-year college degree, which is the majority of Americans, about 60% of adults. The Democratic Party has alienated so many working class Americans that while it claims to speak for them and claims to be in favor of an economy will help them, many working class Americans look at the Democratic Party and say, that's not a party I want to be a part of. They feel that the Democratic Party is deeply judgmental and often harshly judgmental on a long and growing list of things. So for a long time, Democrats said, if we reopen schools in the midst of COVID, we'll be killing people. It turns out in retrospect that we almost certainly kept schools closed for too long, and many Democrats were wrong about that. Many Democrats have told people that if they're concerned about crime, they're just wrong, and that crime and disorder are not actually problems in American cities. If you've been to any American cities lately, you can sort of emerge asking, who are you going to believe the Democratic Party or your lying eyes? Crime has risen. Disorder is a problem. And on immigration, the Democratic Party has moved extremely far left, arguably farther left than any major party around the world. The Democratic Party is very uncomfortable with many ideas involving border security. For a long time, the Democratic Party said the only way people can't be with us is because they don't understand their own interests or because they are hateful. And it's important to say that the Republican Party has often engaged in race baiting and, in fact, outright racism in recent decades. And that has lost a significant number of voters from the Democratic Party who harbor these similarly alarming views. But I think it is a deep, deep mistake for the Democratic Party to say the only reason people could not vote for us is because they are ignorant or hateful. And I've thought this for a long time, but I think the last 5 years have really proven it out, in which large numbers of Latino voters and large numbers of Asian American voters and a few percentage points of black voters, more if you believe the recent polls, have actually moved away from the Democratic Party. And those voters are overwhelmingly working class voters, voters who do not have a four-year college degree. This is the same group of people whose living standards have stagnated in recent years. A recent survey of voters in Texas, specifically Latino voters, conducted by a progressive firm trying to figure out why they moved to the right in the 2020 election, identified two main issues. There are two of the issues I've mentioned. These voters were frustrated that the Democratic Party was against reopening the economy during COVID, and they were frustrated that the Democratic Party didn't take border security more seriously. And so I've just sort of laid out a somewhat grim litany of economic facts and the lack and our political system's inability to respond to them. But I actually emerged from the experience of writing this book deeply hopeful. And I did because I think the experiences of the last 100 years suggest that as a country, our political system is not completely rigged. It actually does have enormous capacity to change our country. And Damien mentioned this idea of democratic capitalism, small d democratic capitalism. I think it's a profoundly important idea. It's a version of capitalism that acknowledges the many, many things the market is good at and also the things that the market is not good at doing. And when you look at our country over the last century, you see that small d democratic movements have transformed this country again and again. The labor movement transformed this country and created an economy in the 40s and 50s and 60s, really did produce prosperity for all. And by the way, in the 40s and 50s, the black-white pay gap and the black-white life expectancy gap were falling, even before the great victories of the civil rights movement, in large part because unions were beginning to allow black members to join them. The civil rights movement is another democratic movement that changed this country. The women's movement, the disability rights movement in the 1970s. Those examples tend to come from the political left, but there are also examples from the political right. The anti-abortion movement did not respond to Roe v. Wade by saying our political system is hopelessly rigged and give up. It organized. It basically took over the Republican Party. It got laws changed in local areas. It got friendly politicians elected, including in Washington. And it eventually got the Supreme Court to overturn a law that it did not like. More recently, if we were sitting here in 2000, how many of us would have thought that marriage equality, same-sex marriage, would be legal as quickly as it has become legal in this country? So when I look at recent history, I see enormous reason to believe that actually our political system and our democracy can be responsive to change. It can create grassroots movements that change public opinion and change the law. To me, the problem is not that our system is totally broken, is that we have not had a political movement on either the right or the left that has been devoted in recent years to lifting the material living standards of most Americans. And I actually, despite all of our problems, emerge optimistic that if we did have that movement, if we did have a movement that spoke for working class people, that appealed to them, and that tried to put in place policies that would improve their lives, the same way the lives of many college graduates, like me, have improved in recent decades, I still think this country has the ability to create an economy that works for all its citizens. Thanks so much for listening.